Hello and welcome to the channel today. I'm Will and I'm starting a new series of videos, starting with this, which is talking about my favourite historical fiction reads of all time. So I'm going to rank them I'm doing my top 40. This video will be tackling 10, and then the next video 10 and 10 and 10. So there'll be 4 videos in total. I've chosen 40, it's quite a random number really, but when I was compiling my list, I felt like these 40 are all books that I love. Whereas if I went any lower, there's a lot more historical fiction books I've read and really enjoyed. I think in total, I've read just over 100 historical fiction books. So I felt it's a good time to make a list like this. In the past on the channel, I did my favourite reads of all time. I think I did my top 80. Maybe I think it was 80. So I did 8 videos there if you want to check that out. But today, I'm honing in a bit, looking at my favourite historical fiction. And so let's kick it off with my 40th favourite historical fiction book of all time is The Forgotten Legion by Ben Kane. This is book 1 of, I think it's called the Forgotten Legion trilogy. This is his book 1. I believe I read this 2 years ago. There's 3 POVs. We have 2 siblings who we see as children. They are slaves, and it's a brother and a sister. So they're 2 of the POVs. And as they get older, they are separated, and one is sold into the gladiator pits. And then the 3rd POV is a bit of an older man, not too old, but he's in his fighting prime, let's say, and he kind of oversees the brother in the gladiator pits, as he is also a slave and a gladiator as well. So we are in Rome. We're thrust into the heart of the Roman Empire just before Caesar reaches his full power. This is the first book I read by Ben Kane, and I really loved his writing style and his approach. It's simple, it's accessible, it's efficient, it's quite stripped back, but in a way that uses immersive language that really brings you into the historical period. And I'm a reader who loves characters. That's my main motivation for reading. The main thing that attracts me to books is character development, standout, strong characters. And in The Forgotten Legion, you really do have that. As I said, there's 3 main POVs, and they are all very vivid and they are brilliant in their own ways. And it's quite fast-paced. It's a book that it had a satisfying end in a way, but you have to read the whole series for it to be satisfying in and unto itself. But I have very warm feelings towards this book when I think back on it, because it really got me engaged in this series that overall I really loved, and it was consistently great throughout. And that started with The Forgotten Legion, and so that is my 40th favourite historical fiction read of all time. Next up, I have another kind of titan of the historical fiction genre, and that is Conor Wooden, and I have Wolf of the Plains, book 1 of his Genghis Khan Conqueror series. I read this, I think, 5 years ago. This may be the book that I read first that's actually on my historical fiction list. As I said, read it about, I think, 5 years ago. It is, of course, about Genghis Khan, and I know that this isn't 100% historically accurate, of course, with many historical fiction books that approach periods more than a century ago. There has to be a lot kind of made up, because there are many gaps in history, in the history of the characters, their motivations, and then also just there's not many documents of the time. But whilst it's not 100% historically accurate, if you approach this just as an enjoyable read, I found it absolutely thrilling. It is true that Genghis Khan had an incredible start to his life, and it is just mind-blowing how he went from a position of being an outlaw who had nothing to becoming the leader of the biggest empire of all time. That is just outstanding. Doesn't mean he was a good person, but it's a story that really shocks you, and it is fantastic reading this book where you see the roots of Genghis Khan. Conor Wooden, he's an author. I think I've read maybe 10 books by him, and every single one I really admire his writing style. A bit similar to Ben Kane in the way that I said it's quite stripped back, very easy to read, very accessible, but very enjoyable, and it makes sure to use the language to create immersion and engagement. Especially with historical fiction, immersion is really, really key to me, and that is very present with Wolf of the Plains. And also there's some action sequences that are just written brilliantly. So the first 2 picks have been first books of series, but now I'm going for a middle book, the second book in the Sigurd trilogy by Giles Christian. This is Viking Age historical fiction. Book 1 is called God of Vengeance, and it's a great kind of vengeance story and coming of age as well. Winter's Fire, our main character Sigurd, he's a little bit beyond that, but he is still seeking vengeance. That is at the heart of the story. Many middle books kind of suffer with the travelling, setting up for the big final instalment, but this avoids that. There is quite a bit of travelling, but in a way that is integral to the plot, and it's very intriguing and engaging, and it serves its own purpose. Giles Christian has a way of each book in this trilogy, whilst they're, of course, one continuous story, each one resolves itself and ends in a satisfying way. That kind of concludes its own mini-story in the book, but continues the overarching plot at the same time. Giles Christian is one of the best writers out there, I think, and especially in the historical fiction genre. His lyrical prose, he turns that to creating an incredible immersive experience, but he also uses it to craft character so well. The nuances of different characters are just brought out so organically and naturally that it becomes a book that not only do you love the plot and the progression and the themes, who doesn't love a coming of age vengeance story? It's hard to beat that. But on top of it, you've got a wide cast of compelling characters. You've got that found family theme that I absolutely love when it's done well. It's something that Papa Gwyn has integral as a key part of many of his stories. And I think that's a reason why I've loved it as a child. And I love it now. And it's very present in Winter's Fire, which is my 38th favourite historical fiction read of all time. So before I was talking about titans of the historical fiction genre, well, I think that is definitely apparent when it comes to Bernard Cornwell, especially in his Saxon stories, better known now as the Last Kingdom series, which is, of course, a Saxon series set in Britain. This is the 8th instalment of that series. It's one that it begins brilliantly. There's a few instalments in the middle that I find drag a bit and fall a bit into a template, just quite repetitive when you read them back to back. But then there's a few instalments, I believe 7, 8 and 9, which I think are my favourites for the series as a whole, because it really adds a new element to the story, which I think begins with the Empty Throne, which is Uhtred, son of Uhtred, of course, our main protagonist, his relationship with his children. The Last Kingdom series, of course, Uhtred is the main character, so by this point, he's an older man. He's not very old yet, but he's getting into his middle age. He's beyond his fighting prime. He's still a warrior. That's a big component of his character and his responsibilities and reputation. But it's at kind of that point where his children now coming of age to have a much bigger role in the events surrounding them. And I really loved how Bernard Cornwell took the time to build those relationships. I think in the installment before this, The Pagan Lord, but then they really fully come to fruition in The Empty Throne. So if you've read and really enjoyed the programme and you're interested in what part of the story this is, it is season 4, the second half of season 4 is The Empty Throne, or widely based off of The Empty Throne. Bernard Cornwell, I'll be talking about a lot in these videos because I think I've got 6 or 7 books by him in my top 40. That just shows what a prolific but also consistent writer he is. And so, yeah, The Empty Throne is my 37th favourite book, historical fiction book, of all time. And now to a slightly different subgenre of historical fiction. I've got some crime historical fiction with Dissolution by C.J. Sansom. This has recently been adapted into a programme where has Sean Bean as an actor in it. It is, as I said, crime historical fiction. We are thrust into the dissolution of the monasteries, of course, with Henry VIII. And here we have an investigation. An investigator, is sent to a monastery, and there has been a murder. We don't know who did it, but we know that the perpetrator is nearby. Our investigator must find out who that is, but also, not just is he investigating this murder, he also falls into the politics of the time, and it's also, he's given some other responsibilities by those above him. I'll leave that vague because part of the enjoyment of this is discovering what those are and the tensions that rise above his name. Dissolution, C.J. Sansom. I love the breadcrumbs. I love that in a crime story. It's quite a fine line, I think, where it feels complex enough that the story keeps on progressing, but it doesn't feel like you've earned it easily. But then you don't want it to go on too long or be too complex that you just have no investment and have no idea what's going on. A good balance is struck in Dissolution. And I love the medieval setting. I love how C.J. Sansom does that really, really well, in my opinion. And yeah, Dissolution is one of those books that I think is also very widely accessible to those who don't enjoy historical fiction usually. It's one that I'd recommend to people who like crime, even if they don't really like period dramas or if they don't read historical fiction beyond a few centuries ago. It's one that I say is a bit of an anomaly, as so many people would enjoy it, which I guess is why it's been made into a program, because it's got such a wide readership. So yeah, that is my 36th favourite historical fiction read of all time. And now number 35, if you follow the Brothers Gwyn, the channel I have with my brother, you will be familiar with this book. It is Dreaming the Ball, the second instalment of the Boudica Quartet by Manda Scott. You'll definitely be seeing me chat about more of this series as these videos go on, but Dreaming the Ball, the second instalment, it is heartbreaking. Manda Scott's power, it lies within her characters. This is probably the most epic historical fiction series I have read in terms of scale, but there's also quite a small cast at the heart of it. And with that small cast, Manda Scott manages to fully flesh out each and every one. Caradoc is amongst the best characters I've ever come across, and he is very central to Dreaming the Ball. I highly recommend this series to anyone who loves fantasy. I think of all the historical fiction books I've read, to fantasy readers, I would recommend The Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell and The Boudica Quartet by Manda Scott. Because I said it is so epic, it feels fantastical, but also because we really, of course, we're thrust into the Roman v the Britons, as of course is about Boudica. There's also an immersion into the culture, and with that we've got a big dreaming aspect as well as we follow Boudica and those around her and the culture of the time, so it feels fantastical in that sense as well. This is my 35th favourite book of all time for historical fiction. I think this is the only one of the series actually I didn't cry at, but I was very close, and there is a huge dose of tension in the mix, and in particular I love the growth that we see with the younger characters in this, as well as still returning characters from the first book, with Caradoc in particular being very close to my heart. It's quite a chunky book, but it's one that's very easy to read and you can blitz through. And so yeah, that is my 35th favourite historical fiction read ever. In the number 34 spot, I have a book that I believe won the Booker Prize, and that is At Night All Blood is Black. What a title, but I also love the title that I think, because this was originally written in French, I believe the original title translates as Blood Brothers. Both are very fitting for the story. We are put into World War I, Senegalese soldiers fighting for the French army, and we follow a soldier who, their best friend is mortally wounded, but they can't bring themselves to put him out of his misery, even though his friend begs for it. And this haunts him. It affects him psychologically to a very, very deep nature. And throughout the course of this book, he then starts to go out at night and kill a soldier across the trenches, and he returns back with part of their body as a trophy. And the beginning of this is he's heralded as a hero by those around him, and he's not an outsider anymore. But as it continues and continues, this is an exploration of a descent into madness. And you see the reaction of those around him as well, and how they distance themselves and become to get more scared of him as this myth of him almost becomes real. And you see how that isolation grows, and it's a vicious circle into this descent into madness. It's a very dark book. It is brilliantly written. It is genius. It's very small. You could read it in a day, and it is one that, whilst very dark, it is one I definitely recommend, and it stays with you. And so that is my 34th favourite historical fiction read of all time. In the number 33 spot, I am returning to historical fiction that goes way, way back in history. And that is Heroes of Chaos, the second instalment of the Three Kingdoms Chronicles. If you like Dynasty Warriors, this is a series for you, as we are thrust into the conflict in China of the Three Kingdoms, people did not know which one was going to emerge. There was a balance of power almost. This is a chronicler's tale. Book 1, which is Yellow Sky Revolt, we follow a very old man as he tells the story of his past. That continues in Book 2, but Book 1 is where this character shows his childhood when he's a very young boy. In Heroes of Chaos, he's still young, he's beginning his soldier training. So he's beginning to get a little bit more responsibility, a little bit more intelligence, and a tiny bit more agency that makes it feel more progressive than Yellow Sky Revolt. And I love to see that progression in a series. But I also love that he's not given too much power, because that really takes away from the realism of books when authors try and force agency onto their character to fit the plot. Heroes of Chaos is another installment of the series where our main character is really in events way above his head and he's dragged along with the tide. But there's a lot of growth here, And I love that we're meeting more characters that will become very central to this series as a whole. And I really love the soldier training. I love that there is this kind of sense of nostalgia that you feel from the narrator, our protagonist, which feels very fitting, but also disillusionment with those seeing this period as that one of glory and fighting for what is right. And he's showing that it wasn't all like that at all. And that's something that we see in a lot of historical fiction nowadays, of course, for those that deal with warfare, because war is not full of glory. And so we, of course, see the disillusionment of that in many books, but I think it's handled in a way here where it doesn't feel just like the same thing again. It feels real, and you have to combat that, especially when you're got a young protagonist as the centre of the focus. But it's done really well, and I really cannot wait to carry on with this series, The Three Kingdoms Chronicles. This is my 34th or 33rd favourite historical fiction book of all time. In the 32nd spot, I've got an author who is more commonly known as being one of the kings of historical non-fiction, and also for being on TV as well. But this is his first fiction work, and that is Essex Dogs by Dan Jones. Me and my brother, we had the absolute pleasure and honour of interviewing Dan Jones over on The Brothers Gwyn, so please do check that out if you would like to. He talks about his writing process, about how he's really got into history, his next projects, and more. This looks at the 100 Years' War. What I really love about Essex Dogs is we're shown the wider scope of humanity. Often in historical fiction or fantasy, we're shown kind of the big campaigns, the movements, the big battles, and etc. But often what is cut out is the grit, the trudging from one place to the next, the kind of the logistics of organising an army's march. And I get why that's often cut out, because that could be quite boring. But as we follow the Essex Dogs, a mercenary group who are really down near the bottom of the pile of the army, it makes so much sense. We see them trudging from one place to the other in the 100 Years' War as they are in France fighting for the English army. And I love that disillusionment again. We're showing that most of these bands, they're not fighting for patriotism. They're not fighting for the glory of England. They're mostly bands being paid for a job. But whilst you've got that disillusionment, I also want a book that has heart. And you find that with the Essex Dogs, because it says on the back, some men fight for glory, others fight for coin. The Essex Dogs fight for each other. Sorry, my voice just completely went at the end there. I'm not sure actually what just happened. But the Essex Dogs, as I said, it's got that grit, but it's got heart as well. I love our cast of characters. It's multi-POV as we follow different members of the Essex Dogs. There's some brutal action sequences, but the characters are at the heart. And I just love how this offers a very different lens on historical warfare from an expert such as Dan Jones. When I started reading this, I thought it may be a bit of a risk. As someone who has so much knowledge about the period like Dan Jones, I imagine it would be very easy to kind of overcomplicate the book or make it dense with historical detail. But he really avoided that, and he said he did that consciously because he knows that not everyone wants to hear about every single fact about the period. And I think it's a very great balance for immersion, but not overwhelming the reader. And yeah, Essex Dogs is really great in every way, and it's my 32nd favourite historical fiction read of all time. And the last one I've got here really is a nostalgia pick. It's a children's fiction that I read when I was younger. It is The Way of the Warrior by Chris Bradford, the first in his Young Samurai series. And it's nostalgia. We've got someone who ends up in Japan. It sounds a lot a bit like the premise of Shogun, where you've got Blackthorn, someone who's thrown into a culture they have know nothing about, and they kind of learn along the way. And you've got that, but in a younger version with The Way of the Warrior. We've got someone who, he's English, his ship is wrecked, his father is killed, and he finds himself somehow in a samurai school. It is in 17th century Japan, I believe, and it's one that's a series of 8, but the first book has the most sentimentality for me because it's where it all began. And I love how this series kind of progresses. I love the characters. If I read it now, it probably wouldn't be on my favourites of all time, but that nostalgia is a very powerful thing. And I'm not saying these are the best historical fiction books of all time. I'm saying these are my favourites. And so that's where, of course, the heavy subjectivity comes in. And it really does show it's so important when in your life you read a book, and that really impacts where it places on your favourites and the sentimentality and where you think of it in years to come. There's many books on this list that I thought would have been higher, but over time they've dropped a bit. And there's books that over time I've loved them even more and more. But this is a book that I think will always be on my list because of that nostalgia. And it's a series I used to just reread again and again and again. When I was about kind of 12 to 14, I wouldn't really read new books. I found about 20 books I loved, and I just reread them. David Eddings' series was one of those, and The Way of the Warrior was another one. And so, yeah, that's my 31st favourite historical fiction book of all time. And that is my first video of this series, my 40th to 31st favourite historical fiction books of all time. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please let me know if you've read any of these. A lot of my favourite authors being discussed here. We'll be talking about more of their books, I imagine, in the videos to come. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you're intrigued to see what books are higher up in my rankings. Please let me know what your favourite historical fiction books are, and predict what you think my favourite of all time will be. But for now, as I said, thank you for watching, and stay safe.